Before beginning plate work, it's really useful to have a guide that's going to help you with determining the composition at the press and when you're creating the plate with the ink and the stencils. We're primarily working with stencils with monotype printing. And because we're doing multiple plate printing with cyan, magenta, and yellow inks, it's useful to figure out where the main compositional elements will be intersecting. So these are some of the stencils that are the larger sized shapes. And here are some that are smaller. And what this will allow us to do is to create areas in the composition that have dominance and areas that are subdominant. You're also going to have different interesting edges and shapes that will be used for halves divisions. And one of the guides that I like to use when composing is the rule of thirds. You may have heard of the rule of thirds in previous design classes or other art classes that you may have taken. And you may have also noticed the rule of thirds as a guide when you're taking photos. Oftentimes, camera viewfinders and smartphone camera viewfinders have the option of overlaying a 1/3 grid over the image area to help you figure out an interesting place to have your main compositional element. So to create our template, we're going to create several different guides to help us. And for that, I'm using tracing paper. I have the 4x6" plate that we've already cut that I'm going to use as a template to give myself the compositional size I'm working within. I also have some of my stencils that are already cut to use for general placement within the frame. I'll start by cutting down several sheets of tracing paper. And I'm going to make 3 different mock-ups to use so I can choose the one that I think is the strongest when I start to prepare the plates for printing. On each piece of paper, I'm going to trace around the plate to create the bounding box of the image area. On one of the sheets, I'm going to draw rule of third grid. To make it easier to align the separate sheets of paper, I have the sheet of tracing paper that has the 1/3 grid on it taped down to my table surface using a piece of low-tack drafting tape. And I'm going to overlay on top of that a second piece of tracing paper lining up the edges. And I like to mark the lower right-hand corner for alignment purposes. In case I need to stack multiple pieces of tracing paper on top of one another, or when I go to the press to know which is going to be my bottom right corner. Now I have several sheets of tracing paper that have the rectangle marked out and the corner marked, and my guide taped to the table surface with the rule of third grid in place. So using the rule of third, I'm going to place my main element first and figure out where is an interesting place to place the main element. Typically it's going to align on one of the 1/3 intersections, so upper left, lower right, or upper right, and have it extend off the page. A few things I want to try to avoid. I want to avoid having the element so large that it fits the composition from top to bottom touching the edge. So large that it fits so it touches at the top and 2 sides. Have it so it's centered in the middle, or having it so it just touches the edge of the frame. These all create awkward tangents that focus the eye on that portion of the composition rather than the interior of the composition. So when you're aligning the object inside of the composition, it's better to have it purposefully inside the composition, really paying attention to tension that's being created with the shape and the edge of the frame, or to have it extend fully off of the composition so it's purposefully cropped. And once you get a portion that you enjoy, trace around the shape. At the press, we aren't going to be following this exact. What we're going to do instead is use this as a guide for placement, because we might have several elements on multiple plates that align in a similar location, and the guide is going to help you in terms of knowing how to place the shapes down on your plate, and then also when you go to the press to make sure that the plates are in the proper orientation. Now, because I have the tracings on two separate sheets of tracing paper, when I'm placing my small element, I can lift it up if needed to put underneath to see how it's going to align with different elements here. If I wanted to see how multiple larger shapes would overlay with one another, I could do the same to see how those overlaps may take place. So that to me starts to be interesting. Now, one thing I noticed though is that the negative space between the shape and the edge of the frame here is roughly the same on the top and the side. So I want to try to modify that so that the negative space is different on either side. The balance element doesn't necessarily have to be exactly on the 1/3 intersection, but it should be roughly placed in that area. You also want to avoid centering the element between the main element and the edge of the frame so the negative space is the same. Instead, try to achieve a variety of the quality, size, and shape of the negative space. And then thinking of how you'd want to place your halves division in the composition. And this is where, for the halves division, it really is useful to be able to place the sheet underneath your main template. So I have my first one finished, and I'll move on to the second. Here are my 3 compositional sketch templates, and you can see that I have the main element roughly placed on the top 1/3 mark, and the balance element that's smaller than the main element is placed roughly on the bottom right-hand 1/3 mark. Notice how I have the main element extending off of the image area. I'm varying the size and shape of the negative space on both the edge of the composition and also between elements. So here we can see this negative space is the smallest, and then it progressively gets larger over here. This is a shape that's also directional, so I'm paying attention to the movement that's being created by the different elements inside of the composition. Here I have a division taking place then at a diagonal, roughly 1/3 of the way over from the left-hand edge of the frame. In this compositional sketch template, I have the main element at the bottom 1/3 mark, the balance element towards the top, and here they're also rotating slightly away from each other, so there's a sense of a spiral taking place. I have the division taking place on a curve that's somewhat near the middle of the page. However, the division that would be taking place here is of an irregular grid or lattice that's going to help to create a sense of unity between the different shapes in the composition. And here you can see the lattice grid that I cut. So I'll be mindful of placing this lattice then inside of the composition so that it helps to unify the different elements. And the last template sketch that I created then has the main element entering the composition from the bottom right, so the center is located near the bottom right 1/3 mark. The balance element is towards the top of the top left, and then again I'm using this broken grid or irregular grid to divide the composition right about the 1/3 mark from the left-hand side. Before I begin working, I'm going to choose the compositional template I think has the most promise to begin with that composition, and then start modifying as I'm working with the printing to see how it can evolve based on the layers that I've already printed. So I'm being responsive to the work that I'm creating, as opposed to sticking very closely to a preconceived idea of what the final image should look like. I find with a little bit of planning, I'm able to get results I'm much more satisfied with, because I can anticipate some of the compositional elements that will be taking place, the tensions and the tangents that I will be creating, and where I'll be able to create emphasis in the composition to direct the attention of the viewer.